The Lectionary. The Old Testament reading for the 10th Sunday after Pentecost is from Job chapter 38. The Lord said to Job, "Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determines its measurements? Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? On what were its bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone? When the morning stars sang together, or who laid its cornerstone when the morning stars sang together, and all the sons of God shouted for joy? Or who shut in the sea with doors when it burst out? Or who shut in the sea with doors when it burst out of the womb? When I made clouds its garment, and thick darkness its swaddling band, and prescribed limits for it, and set bars and doors, and said, Thus far you shall come and no farther, and here shall your proud waves be stayed. Have you commanded the morning since your days begun, and caused the dawn to know its place? That it might take hold of the skirts of the earth, and the wicked be shaken out of it? It is changed like clay under the seal. And its features stand out like a garment. From the wicked their light is withdrawn, their uplifted arm is broken. Have you entered into the springs of the sea, or walked in the recesses of the deep? Have the gates of death been revealed to you, or have you seen the gates of deep darkness? Have you comprehended the expanse of the earth? Declare it if you know all this. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Synopsis. The book of Job is difficult to fit into a context with the rest of the Old Testament with respect to either place or time. In a sense, it does not fit into the framework of the developing of a nation of Israel from its forefather, Abraham, through its history of its relationship with God to the revelation of Jesus Christ in the New Testament and the development of the Christian Church. However, it does deal with two overarching subjects of relevance to that relationship between God and the individual believer. The first is, what is the basis of that relationship? Does the individual follow God's requirements in the law because of trust in God and a love of God? Or is it simply an effort to gain rewards from God and to avoid punishment for disobedience? The second question addressed is one posed often by Christians. Why do bad things happen to good people? In other words, why do evil people seem to prosper without consequences for their disobedience in this world, while faithful people suffer many ills, seemingly for no reason? The book opens with a picture of a very righteous and prosperous Job, and with a direct challenge between God and Satan. Very quickly God asks Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, who fears God and turns away from evil?" Since Satan has declared that he has been going to and fro on the earth, and from walking up and down on it. To this, Satan challenges the reason God gives for Job's faithfulness. Does Job fear God for no reason? Have you not put a hedge around him and his house and all that he has on every side? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But stretch out your hand and touch all that he has, and he will curse you to your face. and that challenge is accepted. God allows Satan to remove all Job's blessings except for the blessing of life to prove his point. And from here, the rest of the book is a dialogue between Job and his friends, or Job and God. After a long series of discussions between Job and his three friends, in which the friends insist that Job is guilty of some great sin, that all this evil has befallen him, to which Job maintains his innocence, God finally grants Job the direct audience that he has been demanding since all this misfortune happened to him. After Elihu declares God's majesty to Job as the ultimate reason to prove that Job has sinned against God, God arrives in a whirlwind to answer Job's question of him. Since Job has become irreverent and demanding of God, God's first response to Job puts him in his place. Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Dress for action like a man. I will question you, and you make it known to me. At this point, we come to our text for today. This is where God points out the fallacy, not only of Job's thinking, but also in the thinking of his three friends. For, beginning with the question, "Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth?" God points out, with a long series of similar questions, that human beings have no standing before God, either to question him or to judge him. After all, he is the Creator, and humanity is part of his creation, a point that St. Paul makes later when he says, "Does not the potter have the right to make out of the same lump of clay some pottery for special purposes and some for common use?" Or Isaiah when he says, "You turn things upside down. Shall the potter be regarded as the clay?" Or that the things made should say of its maker, "He did not make us." Or the things formed say of him who formed it, "He has no understanding." Simply put, it is not our place to question God or to judge whether his actions are fair or correct. As Jesus says, "Thank God that these things didn't happen to you," when questioned about events that happened during his ministry on earth. The simple fact of the matter is, man has no righteousness before God, not even the rightness of trusting or having faith in God, since that in itself is a gift from God. And as far as bad things happening to good people, the problem is, aside from the fact that we have no right to ask that question, it is in assuming that there is such a thing as good people without the intervention of God through his redemption offered in Jesus Christ. Additionally, when God says in our Old Testament text for today, "Have you commanded the morning since your days began, and caused the dawn to know its place, that it may take hold of the skirts of the earth, and the wicked be shaken out of it?" He too is raising the point that a human being who is capable of being evil is incapable of eliminating evil from the creation. Thereby, Job's question and ours have no validity at all. The epistle reading is from Romans chapter 10. For Moses writes about the righteousness that is based on the law, that the person who does the commandments shall live by them. But the righteousness based on faith says, "Do not say in your heart, 'Who will ascend into heaven?' that is, to bring Christ down. Or, 'Who will descend into the abyss?' that is, to bring Christ up from the dead. But what does it say? The word is near you, in your mouth and in your heart. That is, the word of faith that we proclaim. Because if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord, and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. For with the heart one believes and is justified, and with the mouth one confesses and is saved. For Scripture says, "Every one who believes in him will not be put to shame, for there is no distinction between Jew and Greek. The same Lord is Lord of all, bestowing his riches on all who call on him. For everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. But how are they to call on him in whom they have not believed? And how are they to believe in him of whom they have never heard? And how are they to hear without someone preaching? And how are they to preach unless they are sent? As it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who preach the good news. But they have not all obeyed the gospel. For Isaiah says, Lord, who has believed what he has heard from us? So faith comes from hearing, and hearing through the word of Christ. Synopsis. As Paul continues his letter to the Romans, which is really like a series of sermons on the meaning of the gospel, he has now turned to a subject that is dear to his heart. For even though he is writing to the church in Rome, which would include a number of non-Jewish believers, he has begun to discuss the lack of understanding and belief among many Jews that Jesus is the Christ. At the same time, even though he is the apostle to the Gentiles, his fervent hope has always been to nurture faith among his fellow Jews. This being the case, beginning in chapter 9, he has begun to discuss the Jewish understanding of the law of God and its relationship to the gospel of Jesus Christ. In doing so, he begins to explain the difficulty the Jews have in believing in Jesus Christ. Just before our text he writes, "For, being ignorant of the righteousness of God, and seeking to establish their own, they did not submit to God's righteousness. For Christ is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes," and thus describes the reason the Jews have so much problem with faith in Jesus. It is here that we take up our text appointed for this day and see the amount of time that Paul relates law and gospel, and takes up once again a common thread of his proclamation of that gospel, that, "For by grace you have been saved by faith, and this not of your own doing, it is a gift of God." However, Paul does not want to depend on his witness alone, so he quotes Deuteronomy 30:14. "The word is near you, in your mouth and in your heart, to prove salvation by faith from the Old Testament Scriptures." He then ties this Old Testament Scripture to his preaching. That is, the word of faith that we proclaim, and then proceeds to proclaim the function of faith in justification and redemption. Because, mainly, if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord, and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. And, for with the heart one believes and is justified, and with the mouth one confesses and is saved. In the rest of the text, St. Paul proves the availability of redemption and the keeping of the law through faith in Jesus Christ by using a series of provisional statements, each one which is known to be true, which leads to the next provisional statement, and eventually to the ultimate conclusion. So faith comes from hearing, and hearing through the word of Christ. The Holy Gospel according to St. Matthew, the 14th chapter. Immediately Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. But the boat by this time was a long way from the land, beaten by the waves, for the wind was against them. And in the 4th watch of the night he came to them, walking on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified and said, "It is a ghost." And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." And Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." He said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water, and came to Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand and took hold of him, saying to him, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased. And those in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." Synopsis. Immediately Jesus made the disciples get into the boat. If these were not the first words of our gospel reading for today, we would know that this happened directly after the feeding of the 5,000. If this reading was from the Gospel according to St. Luke, rather than the Gospel according to St. Matthew, the word immediately might not catch our attention, because St. Luke normally fixes his events in time. But there must be some reason for St. Matthew to draw our attention to the fact that this miracle happened very soon after the previous one. There must be some reason why the time frame here is important. Since the feeding of the 5,000 happened in the evening, which is likely sometime between 5 o'clock p.m. and 7 o'clock p.m., which is when it started, it would take some time to distribute food to over 5,000 people and to clean up afterwards. Since the relevant events of this miracle happened in the 4th watch of the night he came to them walking on the water, which is between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m., it must have been significant to St. Matthew that this lack of faith happened so quickly, within 12 hours, of the previous miracle that Jesus performed. It wasn't like after a week of preaching parables to the crowd, Jesus suddenly performed this miracle out of nowhere. St. Matthew obviously wanted to make the point that the disciples' faith was very weak when they were not in the immediate presence of Jesus. Although there are some things that modern-day Christians might not remember when reading this story. First of all, several of the disciples were fishermen, and therefore used to dealing with large boats and open bodies of water. Secondly, crossing the Sea of Galilee on a boat was not an uncommon event for these disciples. They had just done so the day before. And finally, the Sea of Galilee is known for its sudden and violent storms. While fear for one's life can certainly overrule one's knowledge and even one's faith to a degree, the experience of being Jesus' disciples certainly should have counterbalanced the experience of facing something different, since being a disciple of Jesus was vastly different than what any of them had ever experienced before. All in all, one might think that these disciples should have shown more courage and faith under the circumstances, until one remembers that many lifelong Christians have shown a lack of faith and courage under less dangerous circumstances. With all these facts as a backdrop, we realize that one of the points of this miracle is to promote us in a stronger reliance on the Jesus who is always with us and always cares for us, both physically and spiritually, in every need. This is only strengthened by the fact that St. Peter, certainly the disciple with the most bluster of the 12, had his faith fail him not only once, but twice, The second time, not only in the direct presence of Jesus, but while he was trying to strengthen his faith on his own. This is to demonstrate that even under the best of circumstances, trying to depend on our own ability to have faith in God is destined to failure. Even though St. Peter was depending on Jesus' faithfulness to accomplish this miracle, "Take heart, it is I." Taking into account that Jesus was willing, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water," he said, "Come." And even after the miracle was basically accomplished, so Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came to Jesus. As soon as he depended on himself, even in the slightest degree, but when he saw the wind, he was afraid and beginning to sink. He failed completely. Faith is a gift of God, begun, nurtured, and carried forward to completion completely by him, with no abilities of ours contributing to its success.